Okay, thank you all very much for coming. No. Right, a couple of things tonight. You may or may not have seen that there's going to be a press release from us, the Stratford Society and the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust about an exhibition that's going to run in Harvard House throughout the summer. And now that they've released, told everybody, we can tell everybody. So please do disseminate, let everybody know, because this is hopefully the beginnings of what may end up being a town museum, which Stratford has long waited for, I think. And also, we need volunteers. So if you've got a few hours to spare, anytime, any day of the week, when we open, when we know what day we're going to be open, please let us know, let me know, or Ellie, who's there, let Ellie know. And if you are willing to be trained as a first aid volunteer as well, that would be good. Because apparently we need a first aid volunteer trained person when we're open. So, okay, I think that's me at the moment. If I think of anything else, I'll let you know. So what did you do in the war then? That used to be a poster. I'm sure it did. When I worked at the Maritime Museum, I'm sure we had a poster on the wall saying you do the war day. And there was a chap who was looking a bit, I don't know. But no problems here. Alistair knows exactly what his dad did in the war. And it's going to be, I think, an action-packed talk tonight.
Don't put pressure on me then.
No, not at all, not at all. So, please welcome our speaker tonight, Alistair Price.
My name is Alistair Price. I wasn't quite sure how the introduction would go, but just to give you half an hour on my background, don't worry. No, 1 minute on the background. Shush. I was with Cadbury Schweppes for 30 years, finished up as sales director for their food service division, made redundant in 2000, then set up my own business, vending, focused on vending, sold it in April 2019. I live in Henley and Arden, lived in Henley and Arden for 45 years. I'm the most recent past High Bailiff of Henley and Arden, called Leet. I'm chairman of the Probus Group in Henley and Arden. I deliver books to schools on behalf of a voluntary organisation. I also work part-time for one of the most fantastic river cruises in Stratford called Avon Boat. I'm there. I'm a crewman, allegedly okay, but I've got to improve and I've got to watch what I say now, haven't I? But Avon Boat, I also work part-time at Stratford Racecourse as a part-time host and steward. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is my background. What I normally say is, if you want to ask questions, by all means do so, because some of us, not all of us, but some of us are of a certain age where come the end of the presentation and you can't remember what you wanted to ask. So feel free, if you want to ask a question, feel free to do so. But I'm happy to take questions at the end of the session. About 6 months ago, I did a presentation to Henley Primary School. And they were 10-year-olds and the history teacher, they were talking about the war. And I said, yeah, I'll come along. I started at 10 and come midday, 2 hours, I was still going strong. And you know what children are like? Mr. Price, we've got a question for you. Don't worry, it won't be 2 hours today, promise you. But okay, I said, there was a very nice little lad sitting at the front here. So I said to the history teacher, I said, look, I tell you what, I'll take one more question. And then this chap, I said, what's your name? My name's Toby. And I said, okay, Toby, what's your question? And he said, can you tell me, Mr. Price, what it was like to fly bombers in the Second World War. And I said, Sunshine, you need to come outside with me. How do you think I am? History teacher said, you can't say that. Anyway, on to what did you do in the war day? Yes, it's indulgent. I suspect many of us will have stories of our parents, relations. I hope you'll find my father's story interesting, and hopefully we'll be able to take it. It shouldn't last more than an hour. My first to pair my talk. It's been something I've been working on over the last 5 years, and I tracked down people who were in Bomber Command. Now, this chap is Flight Lieutenant Clifford Storr, not the one on the left, that's me. That's Flight Lieutenant Clifford Storr. He was a navigator in Bomber Command. The reason he gave me an interview was that he did 50 trips. He was a navigator. He flew Lancasters. Father flew Lancasters. And it was a real privilege to meet him at his nursing home in Banbury, and to hear his story. And what tickled me, he gave me an hour and a half, and the nurse who was with me in October 2023 said he's got to go back to his room now. So we took him back to his room, and as a youngster, and that's him at 23, very good looking young man, and obviously a bit of a ladies' man, because when we got back to his room, there was I have to say, a very attractive Thai nurse making his bed. And he said in front of the nurse and myself, when these two have gone, any chance you could hop into bed with me? That was true. So he was, yeah. Nice, very, very nice guy. So my father was born in White Street in Coventry on the 4th of October, 1919. He had an identical twin brother called Douglas. And this is very significant when we go through the story. He had a sister, Peggy, and his father ran a market stall in Coventry Market. He came from a relatively poor background, did Dad, but he must have been quite bright, because at the age of 13, he won a scholarship to King Henry VIII Grammar School. He matriculated. Now, prior to the Second World War, matriculation meant A-levels, and he got credits in English and history. And it's a brief introduction, then I'll go into a bit more detail. He and his twin brother, so that's my dad there, and that's his identical twin brother. Actually, as a youngster, I couldn't tell the difference. I think they were born 2 minutes apart. They were under 18 Warwickshire table tennis champions. Both joined the Coventry Evening Telegraph as reporters. Both joined the Royal Air Force Volunteer Reserve at Anstey, which is northeast of Coventry. Nice long runway. Father chose navigation because everybody wants to be pilots, but because he was interested in maps and he loved meteorology, the study of the weather. He was called up to the RAF on the 1st of September 1939 at the age of 20. Between February and September 1940, he was based at Catterick in Yorkshire. He flew night fighters, mostly Berry Battles, Blenheims, in the Battle of Britain. Both planes were slow and not much use for their purpose. And I met, you may have seen him on television, I met a chap, I'm very privileged, I belong to the RAF Club through Dad. And I met a chap called Flight Lieutenant Colin Bell, DFC, who was 104 in March this year, still going strong. He took part in the VE Day celebrations. Anyway, he said to me, he flew Mosquitoes, but he said that aircrew called the ferry battles flying coffins because the chances of survival were small if they were engaged by the ME-109, the Messerschmitt from the Luftwaffe. The Luftwaffe, these ME-109s could do over 300 miles an hour. These ferry battles could do about 120. Father was posted to Bomber Command in 1941. He flew 14 different types of aircraft, ferry battles, Hamdens, Manchester, and the Great Lancaster, which was the backbone of the Bomber Command in the Second World War. In 1942, he was posted to Pathfinders. Father was alleged to be very good at his role as a navigator, and Air Vice Marshal Don Bennett felt that they should set up Pathfinders. Now, the reason why did they set up Pathfinders? Prior to about the middle of 1942, bombing was very haphazard. 95% of the bombing missions over Germany up to mid-1942, 95% missed the target or very just completely useless. What the Pathfinders did, they went before the main bombing formations and laid flares, red, orange, amber, and green. And the main bombing formations followed after the Pathfinders, and the strike rate was 45% target hit after Pathfinders were introduced. So father was based at Witton in Huntingdonshire. He was station navigation officer, and he met my mum, who was a WAF corporal. And true story about meeting my mum. Officers and non-commissioned and other ranks weren't allowed to mix. And mum, being generally a very nice and innocent lady, went to meet him for coffee in his office. And when she got in there was a knock on the door from one of father's subordinates, and mum had to hide in a cupboard, much to her chagrin, for 45 minutes whilst this subordinate talked to dad about navigation and various other things. So she always relates that was one of her most embarrassing moments. They eventually married in June 1946. Here's Ken and Douglas in February 1943, very proud in their RAF uniforms. That's my dad, that's Uncle Douglas. And the Coventry Evening Telegraph commented that they thought it would not be a surprise if the High Command banned recruitment of identical twins, particularly in the same service. For some reason, the records of both of my dad and Uncle Douglas were mixed up, and the tooth that had been allegedly Ken's for 2 years was actually Douglas's. So no wonder Ken didn't recall having it being removed. This is my father in uniform in 1941, so a couple of years before, a year before that picture of Douglas and dad, but very proud as in the RAF. Very, very proud of his uniform. This is the an article in the Telegraph advising that talking about the fact that they were twins together. Now, what the Coventry Evening Telegraph did, they produced a thing called the welfare record, which was produced weekly. So for any member of staff from the Coventry Evening Telegraph who were in the services, they report on them, they talk about them. So they'd say the officer twins. So that's my dad and that's Uncle Douglas. There's an article which I won't read to you, but it was in the Coventry Evening Telegraph talking about father having gained the rank of squadron leader in June 1943. My dad actually did 58 missions and would have been grounded after 60. He then had been employed in training and various other things on the ground. The life expectancy of RAF bomber crew, who are all volunteers, was 5 trips. Father did 58 trips. Goodness knows how I'm here and how the hell did he do 58 trips, but he did. He won the DFC, which is the replica here, and the real one is down here, in July 1943. And just going back to life expectancy, the life expectancy of bomber crew was actually less than officers in trenches in World War One. In fact, 38,205 bomber crew were lost during World War II on missions. So if you go to the memorial at Hyde Park, it'll say, I think it's 57,000, but a lot of those were lost in training accidents. It was horrendous.
This for me is very significant, as you see as the story unwinds. This is Lancaster Q Queenie, R5868 on display at Hendon Air Museum. A total of 6,924 Lancasters were built between October 1941 and May 1945. And as I said earlier, of these 3,249 were lost in action, but 1,005 in training accidents and non-combat actions. That's still there, actually. Well, I'll talk about this in a minute. That's the inside of a Lancaster. That's where the pilot sat. Now, the only person in a Lancaster who had protection with reinforced steel was the pilot. Because obviously the German aircrew would try and take out the pilot. So there would be the bomb aimer down there, pilot sat behind here in the navigator seat, wireless operator, mid-upper gunner. And I was very privileged in September 2023 to go in the Lancaster, only on a taxi trip, but to go in a Lancaster at East Kirby. I mean, they're so small. And bearing in mind, some of the trips they did over Germany were 7, 8, 9 hours. How they could do that, I do not know. This is the Q Queenie again, and on the side here, it's the RAF bomber crews taking the mickey out of Hermann Göring. Hermann Göring was the chief of the Luftwaffe, and he boasted to Hitler that no enemy plane will fly over Reich territory. And what the RAF then did, put it on the side of this Lancaster that's still at Hendon Air Museum. Lancaster had no ventral gun turrets. What is a ventral gun turret? A ventral gun turret is in the base of the fuselage, which meant that made them extremely vulnerable to German night fighters who tapped underneath the aircraft. And the first that the crew knew was when they had cannon exploding inside the aircraft. Many RAF airmen lost their lives as a result. Now, this was an instruction from Air Vice Marshal Bomber Harris, in charge of Bomber Command, who said it's preferable to have radar in terms of weight to find our way to the target than to have ventral guns. Colin Bell, Flight Lieutenant Colin Bell, said to me, some of the more enterprising aircrew did have guns fitted. They were Brownings, but the problem was they'd freeze at 20,000 feet, so it wasn't much good. And this situation was only corrected in the latter part of 1944, when it was too late for many of the aircrew who had perished. Just as a matter of interest, the flying fortresses from the American Air Force had ventral guns. So they had guns underneath the fuselage, so they could see the Luftwaffe coming to attack them. This is the logbook. Each aircraft has a logbook, and this is a copy of the logbook that I saw at Hendon Air Museum. And it says that they did a trip on the 25th of July, 1943, over Essen to Essen. Now, what was key about this was the special passenger was General Anderson from the US Air Force. And as I said earlier on, the US Air Force didn't believe that the RAF Bomber Command were taking the same risks as the Americans. The Americans were flying during the day. They were better armed, but the British were flying at night. And so he was invited on board. And my father was the senior officer, but the captain of the aircraft was always the pilot. So Dad was subordinate in terms of flying this aircraft, although he was the senior officer on the aircraft. Anderson came up in the aircraft. I've seen in writing his response afterwards, because he said we were in formation, and to see a bomber blown up in front of you with guys you'd been drinking with the previous night in the bar was horrendous. And when he came down, I've seen written notes from my father saying Anderson corrected his supposition that the RAF Bomber Command weren't taking the same risks. Horrendous. They were taking the risks.
And when you're flying at night and all you can see was flak coming up, and if you were coned by a series of lights from below, you've got no chance, because the Luftwaffe night fighters could take you out quite easily. This is my father's logbook, which correlates there with the trip to Essen. But you'll also see, and there's an entry here, which says that he was posted missing on the 27th of July 1943. And father, who was station navigation officer, as I said, he'd done 58 trips. He had been grounded at 60. He was not supposed to fly regularly, and he'd been grounded after 60, as I said earlier on. The story goes, the Canadian navigator, who was due to fly in the Mosquito. The Mosquito had two crew, pilot, navigator, and the navigator doubled up as a bomb aimer, photographer, and guns as well. And but he said, any chance you could let me off, because I've met a girl and I'd quite like to take her out. And Dad said, well, actually, there's nobody to take your place. And so he thought, father, I know this for a fact. He thought he'd get back. And the reason for that is that it was a two-man operation to Duisburg. It was a reconnaissance trip. The Mosquito at the time was the fastest, highest flying aircraft of both the RAF and of the Luftwaffe. It could do 378 miles an hour. It could fly at nearly 30,000 feet. It was very fast because it was made of wood. And he thought he could get there and back without any problem. Got to Germany, did their reconnaissance, and unfortunately over Holland, they were hit by chance guns. The aircraft caught fire and was shot down. And there was only one way in and out of this aircraft, by the cockpit here. So the Schneider, Flight Lieutenant Schneider, turned the aircraft over. He tumbled out. The aircraft was now in flames, wooden aircraft in flames. Father hadn't got his parachute on, or he hadn't got the parachute on from the guy whose place he'd taken. Now, my father was 5'7½", about the same height as me now. The Canadian navigator, whose place he took, was 6'2", so it was quite a difference. So he put the parachute on, but didn't have time to adjust it. And what happened was, Dad jumped, hit the tail fin, burnt his leg, pulled the ripcord, and all I'd say, ladies and gentlemen, I'm lucky to be here, because there was about a foot gap between the parachute straps and bits and bobs down below. So he was shot down. Good thing it was over Holland, because if it had been over Germany, Goebbels, who was the propaganda minister, was saying to the Germans, they are gangsters. If you see them, you kill them. Kill them with pitchforks. Fortunately, it was over Holland, and this is a telegram from the Air Ministry saying, my dad was missing, and as soon as we get any information, we will be in touch with you. Now, they heard nothing, but in late August 1943, before it was known that my father was safe, his brother, Flight Lieutenant Douglas Price, who was based at Reykjavik in Iceland, in Coastal Command. My father always said it was a cushy number because they were never bombed by the Germans, and all they had to do was look for submarines, but that's what Dad said. But he persuaded, and this is the Second World War, its height, Douglas persuaded his commanding officer that he should go to Witten, fly to Witten from Iceland, to meet Father's commanding officer, to tell his commanding officer that he was actually safe. And that is what he did. he presented himself to my father's commanding officer, Group Captain Graham. Captain Graham was saying, "Hi, Ken, what are you doing here? You've been shot down. I didn't know. How did you get back?" He said, "Well, actually, I'm his identical twin brother." But what he said to Captain Graham, and Captain Graham believed him, was that identical twin brothers, and I think this has been posted on a number of occasions, not just about my dad, had a great fraternal link. And he said, "I know my brother is safe." And as it happened, it turned out to be the case. First, his family knew anything was on the 3rd of September, when they had a telegram saying that father was a prisoner of war. That's the 3rd of September. So from the 27th of July 1943 to the 3rd of September 1943, they knew nothing other than the fact that my uncle believed he was alive. What happened was, Dad landed in Holland. He was picked up by the resistance after a week. What they did, they disposed of his uniform, which I don't think, in retrospect, he didn't think either was a good idea. But more importantly, they got rid of his 2 dog tags. At the time, you may correct me, but I think servicemen still have 2 dog tags now. So one is to pass back through the Red Cross to the family and to his unit. The other one was to be kept with the body. But the resistance got rid of both his dog tags. They put him in a peasant's uniform and they placed him in a Catholic church for refuge. The Catholic priest got scared and betrayed him to the Gestapo. The Gestapo were not very nice people, to say the least. They were part of Himmler's SS, and they accused my father of being a spy. They definitely beat him up, broke his ribs. I've got factual evidence of that. And more frightening was they took him out, because after the war, Dad had to do a debrief, and they took him out 3 times to be shot. And each time they had blanks in the guns. And it was that they did that to upset him, to cause him to tell them stuff they wanted to know about where he was based. A bit about Bomber Command. They knew he was quite high up in Pathfinders, but they didn't know enough information. He was eventually rescued by an alleged, and I say alleged, at the end of my presentation, you'll see this alleged Luftwaffe officer was not who he said. He was rescued by a Luftwaffe officer, transferred to a Stalag Luft. Now, Stalag Luft is a transit camp on the 21st of August 1943. He spent 2 weeks in hospital where his ribs were healed. He was then transferred to Stalag Luft 3 in Poland, which is a camp for RAF officers. It had 4 compounds. It's interesting that whilst Dad was in hospital, he was approached by a man in a Red Cross uniform with a clipboard of detailed questions. Again, to try and put him at ease, the medic suggested the answers would be passed back to Switzerland and his family and his former unit, and that he was safe and as a prisoner of war. But father was put off when he saw shiny jackboots beneath the white coat. He was required simply to give name, rank, and number under the Geneva Convention, which is what he did, and he declined to fill in the questionnaire. The false medic was clearly a German trying to elicit information from him. So father finished up in Stalag Luft 3 from the 26th of August 1943 until the end of January 1945. It's a picture of my father, where I won't go through all that, but that's a picture in the Coventry Telegraph talking about him being awarded the DFC, acting squadron leader. And the first communication. This card was written by my father on the 21st of August 1943. This is in pencil. Okay. They were allowed, prisoners of war were allowed to send 4 cards and 3 letters back to the UK. Written on the 21st of August 1943, landed at his parents' house in Coventry in mid-October 1943, because the cards had to be moved via Switzerland, back Portugal, which was a neutral country, then back home. It's a long-winded operation. As it happened, his parents, friends were allowed to send any number of cards and letters via the Red Cross to him, but he was only allowed to send 3 or 4, and all the cards were censored. This is Stalag Luft 3 in 1943. It was built by Polish prisoners in 1942. And the Germans, they're still a very highly intelligent race. This was built on sand. And the reason they built it on sand was to prevent tunneling. Because if you can remember as youngsters, we tried to tunnel in the sand on the beach and it would just collapse. So they built it on sand. And the other thing they did was they built them on stilts. And the reason they did that was they had ferrets, or the German guards, could go underneath the huts and see if they were tunneling. And so it was quite traumatic. There were 4 compounds in Stalag Luft 3. The North compound where Dad was based, all officers, they weren't required to work. The non-commissioned officers were required to do work details. And just to put your mind at rest, there were no Americans in North Compound. No Americans took part in the Great Escape. Fact. So Steve McQueen jumping over the bloody wall in a motorcycle, rubbish. Not true. And that was they only did put that in the film to sell it to the Americans. In fact, Father was one of the advisors for the Great Escape film. But you know, the Great Escape, when you watch the film now, it's an entertaining story, but it's in the spring. The actual Great Escape took place in -20 with snow on the ground. More of that in a minute. So I was privileged to go there in 24th of March 2019 to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the Great Escape, which is the subject of a different talk. This is a goon box. So up here there will be machine gunners all round the camp, and there's 2 barbed wire fences here, and if they were playing football or some ball game and the ball went over the fence, they had to get permission to go and get the ball. Sadly, some prisoners of war who've been there since the start of the war and, you know, Dunkirk, couldn't face being a prisoner of war anymore. And so they intentionally went to the wire. They were challenged, and if they didn't stop and go back, they were shot. So they committed suicide. Just 4 pictures of the pictures of life in camp. You'll note the fire pool. So each compound had a fire pool because the huts were made of wood. They're queuing for food. They walked 2 miles around the camp and again the goon box. Interesting about food. The Germans allowed 1,000 calories per prisoner of war, even in 1943, which was nowhere near enough. So fortunately, certainly until the latter part of 1944, they got Red Cross parcels, which contained another 1,000 calories. So their average calorific intake was 2,000 calories, which was okay. But from when the Germans were losing the war from about late 1944, these Red Cross food parcels ceased, well, very, very few. Now, why have I got a front door here? Now, this front door, this side image, is what is now the top hotel in Sargen. In the Second World War, it was a hospital. So they had a hospital in camp, and minor operations, dental things were done in camp. But if it was necessitated a general anaesthetic, appendix, something like that, they were taken to this hospital. I stayed there in March 2019, and the beds were identical to what they were in 1943. I'm not kidding you. The springs, well, I won't go into details, but just to suffice to say, the backside was very red, the springs. But it was dirt cheap. I drink white wine. For those of you who know me, I drink white wine, and a large white dry white wine was £1.50 at that hotel. So that's the old hospital. This is a card home for my father, 16th September, very upbeat, talking about learning German. I'm enjoying the sunshine, meeting people. Please keep me posted and keep in touch. That's the 16th of September, 1943. And he's talking about sharing with other officers from Leicester, Coventry, and Birmingham. Now, this is a very significant picture. That's Dad there. He's got an RAF uniform back from which he got from the Red Cross. Now, this picture was sent to his parents in October 1943, taken by this chap here, Hartmann Pirber. He was an honourable German officer. That's him talking to Group Captain Massey, who was the senior British officer in North Compound. But what Hartmann Pirber wanted to demonstrate was that Germans were courteous, mild-mannered, and behaved properly towards prisoners. He was also really interested in photography. So he took that picture of Dad with his other 5 officers, and it was sent home. It's just worth saying that most of the Luftwaffe guards were over 50. They first served in the First World War, but were too old to fight now. My father produced and acted at the Camp Theatre. Some of you may remember Roy Dotrice, Peter Butterworth, Bernard Cribbins, and Rupert Davis, all of whom were in Stalag Luft 3, as well as the legendary Dougie Barder. I met Dougie Barder. Dad didn't like him, but I was only 8. I met him when they were doing the filming of The Great Escape. He was the most objectionable man, which is why the Germans took his legs away and put him in Colditz. He wind up the Germans, and of course, winding the Germans up meant all the rest of the prisoners of war had problems as well, thanks to Mr. Barder.
Can I just add to that, should I interrupt? My father met Douglas Barder and couldn't stand him. My father was on Spits and Hurricanes all through the war, maintaining them. And when you tried to help Barder into the cockpit, he was told in no uncertain terms to ladies present.
Yes.
Go away.
Yeah. No, I can relate to that. But as an 8-year-old, we were, after the Second World War, we were all brought up to respect our.
Oh, absolutely, but that's why he was.
No. But I didn't like the man at all. He was not a very nice man. Anyway, one play Dad helped produce was called Alice and Her Candle, in which men dressed as women. The camp commandant who saw the show said the ladies were too good to be true, or perhaps too true to be good. Alice and Her Candle. Think about it. Well, don't think about it. This is what's left of the Camp Theatre now. So here was the stage. They could fit in here. This is when I took this picture in 2019. They used to sit on Red Cross boxes to watch the show. And under here, everybody says, "Oh, there were loads of tunnels being dug in Stalag Luft 3, but there was a 4th tunnel called George, which was underneath the stage. They never used it for escape. They used it to store sand. But that's as it was now. This is a card home on the 21st of September. Father, I won't read it all to you because you can read it. The novelty rapidly wears off. Bearing in mind, on the 16th of September, he was quite upbeat. 21st of September, and he's quite down. It's quite therapeutic. He's looking forward to the end of the war and going to the Cottage. Now, Cottage is a pub in Coventry which still exists. This is a Christmas menu from December 1943, and all this here was made from Red Cross parcels. And each officer had their own little card to remind them of that, and that's I've got at home now. He was one of the editors of Scandriff. Now, Scandriff was what was called the camp newspaper. So they had innocuous stuff. They couldn't, talking about education, meetings with the commandant, hockey, social activities. They were not allowed to say what they knew, what was going on with the war. Bearing in mind, this is late 1943. And because they got radios in the camp, and what they did at night, they'd take out the radios, and all little bits of parts were in the walls of different huts. They were able to tune in to the BBC. And they also had contact with the RA at Norwood. But they weren't allowed to report that, which I thought was quite interesting. Father helped produce that because he was obviously a newspaper man himself with the Coventry Evening Telegraph. Dad operated as a penguin, and he walked 2 miles around the camp every day, disposing of sand from the tunnels. Now, the sand, they had to get rid of the sand. This is sand I got from Harry over there. It's very large. And of course, if you just put sand on the ground, the Germans would immediately know you're digging tunnels. So what they had to do, they had bags inside their trousers and little strings inside their pockets, and they'd shuffle along and shuffle it into the earth. There were a number of other ways they did it. They put them into the vegetable plots. They put them down disused tunnels, but it was one of the major problems of tunneling that they had to get rid of sand. Father perfected his German. He was, by the end of the war, he was absolutely quite fluent, and he engaged with German guards to get contraband. And the reason he did that was that he'd have a coffee with them. They'd commiserate how bad the war was, and isn't it dreadful? And Dad would say, any chance you could get me, I don't know, something innocuous like a book. And eventually, Father used to say, I need a compass, I need some radio parts, I need a spanner. And the German guard who he got would say, well, I can't do that. And Dad said, Dad said, well, actually, don't you think your camp commandant would be interested to hear that you've been giving me this stuff already? So it's in your interest probably to help me, which is exactly what happened. He helped plan the Great Escape. The guy who led the Great Escape was Squadron leader Roger Bushell, who'd been a prisoner of war since 1942. And what was interesting to me was that they had to plan various things that they needed for the escape. And of course, one of the things they needed when they'd escaped was a map. Now, the maps in the aircraft were paper. They would disintegrate, particularly if it was damp. So what Roger Bushell said to Wallingtons, I want you to produce a silk maps of Northern Europe. So this is one that Father had, which was got to the camp. So that's a map of Northern Europe, Germany. So they had some vague idea, but this one was in a little pocket in a book. And what the guys who were sending books over, which was fairly innocuous in itself, they put a little red mark on the book to say there's contraband in here. So it could be a compass, could be a map, could be a pair of pliers. Very, very cleverly done, actually. So that was Dad's right up to the end of the war. This is a detailed drawing of H for Harry from Hut 104. You'll note the workshop at the bottom of the tunnel, that was 25 foot deep and 336 feet long. They actually dug the main tunnels were Tom, Dick and Harry, and they had to get rid of 200 tons of sand, and they had to shore up the tunnels with 4,000 bedboards. So when Father got to the camp, he had, I think he said, about a dozen bedboards at the end of when the escape took place in March 1944. He had just 6. So it must have been quite uncomfortable. But you needed bedboards to shore up the tunnel. So along here were bedboards, shoring up the tunnel. There were rails and workshop down here. Now, you're probably all going to say, how did the Germans not know that they were digging a tunnel? Well, what they did, they dug the tunnel from underneath the stove in each hut. And what they did, they took the stove away, drilled through the concrete, and the concrete was clearly in the ground. So the Germans couldn't see what was going on. Very, very clever. Tom was found by the Germans destroyed. Tunnel Dick, they must have smelt something, the Germans, because what they did, Dick was quite near the perimeter fence, but they cleared about 100 yards of trees. And so it made it virtually impossible to get out. So Dick was aborted, and they used Dick and George underneath the theatre for sand. So Harry was the one that they concentrated on. I saw Harry. That took a year to build. But the Germans knew something was going on. And so on the night of the 24th, 25th of March 1944, Squadron Leader Bushell, who was the leader of the escape organization, decided they would go. And he decided that they would try and get 200 out, 200 prisoners of war. All the 200 were gathered in Hut 104. There's a replica hut at Stalag 3 to this day. The first 25 who were out of the tunnel were the key organisers. Father wasn't a key organiser. He helped, and luckily for him and me, he was 182 to come out of the tunnel. As it happened, which in a way was good, what happened was they started digging at 8:30 at night. At 9:30, they still were digging. And because it was frozen, -20, snow on the ground, to their horror, they were about 10 yards short of the tree line, which was horrendous. So what they had to do, instead of getting an escapee out every 3 minutes, it had to be every 8 minutes, because they had to get a pulley, which was like this. Yeah, you can see this is a pictorial description, but basically guards walked up and down outside the perimeter every 90 seconds. So when the guard was furthest away, the chap who just got out would pull the cord and say, right, the next one can come out. So that's how they operated. And they did that until about 2:30 in the morning. 2:30 in the morning, the first time that the camp had not communicated properly with the RAF High Command in England, was that the RAF decided to bomb the marshalling yard, big train area near the camp. And so what happened was they bombed the marshalling yard and all the lights went out in the camp. But more importantly, the lights went out in the tunnel because they'd stolen some wire. They rigged up a really excellent wiring system, but the lights went out in the tunnel. How frightening is that? 9 blokes down in the tunnel, no lights. They had anticipated it because they had candles, and they had bellows underneath here. They had bellows to blow air along. But if you've got candles and you've got air being blown, that's not very safe. So this went on for about 2 hours. At 4:30, the lights all went back on in the camp, and they continued to come out. What they decided to do was that there was no way at 4:30 in the morning they were going to get out 200. So anybody from 100 back to 200, including my dad, went back in the RAF uniforms, destroyed all their identification, anything incriminating they destroyed. And actually 76 got out. And 76 got out. 23 got back to the camp, 3 got home. 2 were Norwegians. And the reason Norwegians were able to get back home quite so well, they were able to blend in with the local population because Germany had annexed Norway, and they were using a lot of their Norwegians as forced labour. So the 2 escapees were able to blend in with the local population quite well. The other one was a Dane, and what they did, they went to Danzig and sneaked on a ship going to Sweden. So there were 3. According to camp guards, it tied up 5 million Germans looking for the escapees, but 73 were recaptured by the 31st of March. So, a matter of less than 7 days, and they were recaptured. But what was more harrowing was that 50 were shot. Hitler was absolutely livid about the escape. He said, I want all those who escaped, I want all those who are still in Hut 104, and I want the camp commandant, and I want the guards all shot. Interestingly, Göring, boss of the Luftwaffe, and Heinrich Himmler said, hang on a minute, you can't do that because the English have got Luftwaffe prisoners of war, and maybe they'll shoot them. We wouldn't have done so, but maybe they would do that. But anyway, Hitler said, right, I want 50 shot. I want all the organisers, including Bushell. And what they did, unlike the film, they weren't taken in a lorry and shot. They were interviewed by the Gestapo in 2s. And on the way back to camp, they said, right, we're going back to camp now. We believe your story. They were invited to have a comfort break. Whilst they're having a comfort break, the Gestapo shot them, all 50 of them, in the back of the head. And it's very interesting that 50 were cremated. So the only things that came back were their personal belongings back to the camp. When interviewed, when the senior British officer at camp interviewed the camp commandant and said, I accept that escapees you can shoot, but surely there must have been some injuries. Surely somebody, they can't all have been shot. And the camp commandant said, look, I can't give you any information. That is exactly what happened. That was the story. And the guys felt very embarrassed that my father felt sad and embarrassed that they'd survived. And what happened was the Germans, they couldn't find the entrance to the tunnel, so they sent one of the guards from the outside here back down the tunnel, and eventually he had to come out through Hut 104. And what the Germans did was parade them -20, snow on the ground, in their underpants, because they wanted to know from the guys who were still there, how many had escaped, and the background to the whole thing. They were there from 4:30 in the morning until 8:30. Nasty pieces of work. This is the after the escape taken by a German guard. You can see the trolley there. You can see all the bedboards. Now this guy is the camp commandant, Oberst Colonel von Lindner. Now he was an honourable German. He believed in the Geneva Convention. He was an aide to Kaiser in the First World War, and he was on Hermann Göring's personal staff at the start of World War II. And he was sent to the Eastern Front as a result of the Great Escape. And he was injured twice, but he survived until 1965. This is an article in the Prison of War, which was produced by Sir Anthony Eden, who was the Foreign Secretary, in response to the Germans said that we had no moral right to accuse them of murdering escapees when we started the bombing of civilians, which was 100% not true. Bombing of civilians, actually, the first bombing of civilians was the Blitz in Coventry in November 1940. So it's very close to here. And that you know, that's something that Sir Anthony Eden didn't get out of the Germans. The Germans denied it, as usual. This is a card home, 29th of July 1944. I've got loads of these cards, but he's talking about, we're different part of the camp. I spend a great deal of my time looking out the window. Sometimes us fellows in this part of the camp see females walking up and down, and you can imagine the excitement that caused. Trust all's well with you. And this is a card. This is a card that Father sent on the 29th of December 1944, talking about the unhappiest day of my life. Here's a censor. Dad obviously wrote something that he was not allowed to say. In Stalag of 3, 10,000 prisoners of war, there were 100 lady females who were censors checking cards, and they'd obviously put a line through that. I can't read what the actual card said. In October 1944, the Russians were approaching from the east, and so began the long march from Sargon, which is a subject of another talk that I'm putting together at the moment. They didn't know. They were only 26 miles from the camp, and the prisoners of war didn't know whether they were going to be used as human shields, whether they were going to be shot by the SS, or just left there. They had no idea. But as it happened, they decided they would march them west out of the Russians approach, then west, east, west, and over a period from the end of January to April 1945, they walked 500 miles. And the food was virtually non-existent. Out of 10,000, many had dysentery, flu and frostbite. Very unhygienic. They had to drink snow, which was contaminated. And unfortunately, during the march, towards the end of March 1945, they were machine gunned by an American armed group, American Air Force group, and 50 shot and lost their lives. They were eventually met in April 1945 by an American Army group, and Dad was free at last. The war ended on the 7th of May, and Father's letter home was this. I won't highlight all the stuff, but he's just talking about first letter you've had from me for some time. Free men again. A day after hearing the battle south of here, the armoured cars and tanks drove in today. I almost kissed the driver, a lieutenant from the Cheshire Regiment. And on the back of the no, this is significant as well. On the 3rd of June 1945, a Luftwaffe officer surrendered his Luger and 100 rounds of the ammunition to my father. The Luger we had at his home in Ivor until his death in 1980. I should have had it demobilised because at the time there was a lot of publicity about servicemen from the war having memorabilia. I should have had it demobilised. But what I did, Mum and I decided we'd throw it in a local canal along with 100 rounds of ammunition, which I'm assuming is still there. Normally, but not today because I was on the train, I would show you a replica Luger, but I decided it was perhaps a little bit inappropriate to bring a replica Luger along because I was seen walking down Stratford, I see myself being surrounded quite quickly. Anyway, so I've got a replica. On his return from England, he was issued with a booklet called Going on Leave, giving advice to prisoners of war on what to expect now they're home. This is an extract, which I thought was quite interesting. People stand in queues waiting for their turn to be served with rations or meat or groceries. Trains are usually packed because they've been taken off due to war traffic. All needs good humour, so get ready and don't let your own war weariness get you down or your friends. On the reverse was a note to himself talking about Yvonne, that was my mum. He owed £1 to Mr. and Mrs. Bushell for a birthday present on the 21st of June. His sister Peggy, who lived in Coventry, and a planned visit to Coventry. Now this really bugged my dad. This, as you may remember, handwritten, it's a tax demand for year ending April 1944 for £43 and 15 shillings when he was a prisoner of war. And he had to pay it. He had to pay it. So prisoner of war, he still had to pay tax. Nothing's much changed, has it? This is a picture of my parents in Exeter, my mum and dad. Dad, when he was released, when he got home, he was 6 stone. When he joined the RAF, he was 9 stone, something like that. And because, and even that's a year later, and he really did suffer from his time as a prisoner of war. Now, you may remember me saying the alleged Luftwaffe officer. Now, this guy is a chap called Sergeant Taco Wachwick, Romanian SS. And it was he who pretended to be a Luftwaffe officer rescuing my father from the Gestapo in August 1943. And the reason I was able to track him down was this. Now, this is a letter that was written on the 13th of November, 1947. So we're talking 2 years after the war. And it was written to my dad because he was being held as a prisoner of war by the Canadians on being held on war crimes. And he asked my father for reference for his good character and the fact that he got him released from the Gestapo. There's no record of my father's response, but Mum always used to say there was absolutely no way he was going to give him a reference because there was no way he was going to do that. Father was demobbed in April 1944 and he joined the Civil Aviation Authority. And I learnt in recent years that he was one of 5,000 civil servants destined for underground shelters in the event of nuclear war. He retired in 1978, ill health diet, mostly from his time as a prisoner of war. Much of the time after the war, he was in bed, ill, really, really horrible. And it was all due to his time as a prisoner of war. This is my parents in March 1980. What's significant about that? Father is wearing, he's very proud. This is the tie. It's a tie with barbed wire and RAF. So Dad, it indicates he was shot down and was a prisoner of war. And he was very proud about wearing that, and that was March 1980. What we managed to do in March 1980, we got Dad a visit to Hendon Air Museum to visit the Lancaster that he flew in 1943. So we managed to get Dad, and that's Dad on the right-hand side, and that's Squadron Leader Diamond at the entrance to the Lanc. I tried to get in the Lanc about 6 years ago, but it won't allow people in it anymore. It's radiation. There's a radiation problem. And this probably is one of the most poignant moments for me. That's my father, March 1980, same navigator seat that he sat in on the 25th of July 1943. And I always remember seeing him there and how proud he was to have sat in that seat. Significant moment for me, and I even have a thing down the back my spine thinking about it now. This is a cross that was at the Remembrance Garden of Remembrance in Westminster Abbey in November last year, talking about remarkable man Kenneth Price, DFC. Father eventually died on the 25th of April 1980, so he's been sadly gone 45 years. And I have to say, one of the things I like doing about the talk is I always remember him. We were drinking pals and friends, and it brings it all back to me. And during lockdown, I wrote a book on him, which by coincidence I have here. Surprise, pride. And that, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry I've gone on slightly longer than I should have done, but that, ladies and gentlemen, is my story. Well, thank you. Anybody's got any questions?
Just as a navigator, he will have learned how to use the sextant. Did he ever teach you how to use a sextant? Do you have one?
I did learn how to use a sextant. One, because I learned to fly myself.
Right.
And I've got a lapsed private pilot's license, and I also use a sextant because I can sail half-ton yachts.
Wonderful.
Wonderful. But I'm not allowed to drive boats on the river. No, I'm not. Anybody else?
It's just this thing of the RAF Voluntary Reserve. And what my father was in that, and he didn't join up until 1942, born in 1923. I could never work out what the difference was from just reading the RAF.
Well, the RAF Volunteer Reserve was a volunteer group.
Yeah.
You weren't conscripted to do that. When joining the RAF, you were conscripted to go and join the RAF. So he was moved from the reserve to the RAF, and it was his choice. He didn't want to go in to the Navy. He didn't want to go in the army.
Well, that was my dad. He said he wanted to go in the RAF. So he would have joined up pre being called up.
Yes.
Is that how it works?
Yes.
Right.
Nick?
Yeah, just what point did the Germans discover the escape? I mean, what was it that triggered the discovery?
Oh, very interesting point. It was triggered because the German guard who was marching up and down saw number 76 coming out the tunnel, and he took a pot shot at him. Fortunately, he missed. And I know I met the chap in the book, but his name is Flight Lieutenant Jack Lyons, and I interviewed him. He was 100 then. I interviewed him in October 2017, and he was the bloke who was shot at, but he missed. And that's when it all blew up, and that's when the Germans knew there was a big escape.
Alistair, just the point, the gentleman who rescued your dad from the SS with the feds, yeah, Bush, what's his name, Bush?
Yeah, Jakob Wojcik.
Yeah, what a possible thought. That's the uniform of the Handschar division, so they were Muslim SS, which is quite a strange concept because you think of racial purity and all that nonsense. So he would have been seconded, and I noticed on the letter he's Sicherheitsdienst, that's secret security police. So he was sort of spanning several different divisions, but maybe his beliefs made him do the wrong thing. We don't know. But so, yeah, so they had Muslim SS members.
I didn't know that, but
Yeah.
it is very logical.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Oh, Johnny's silent. Well, silence is golden. It means you must have liked it a little bit.
Indeed.
Thank you, Alistair.
Next.